I think we finished on text 11 or something like that last week. But just as far as a recap goes, to get us warmed up for today's class, there is a body of literature called the Upanishads, and they predate the Gita. This is it's actually somewhat of a vexing subject, because when you think about a religious text, a holy book, then, and you're not going to find this in the book, so looking at the book's not going to help you. When you find a religious text or a holy book, it's understood that you're engaging with perennial philosophy, forever philosophy. As such, there's this idea that we have in our minds that such books would have been written at the dawn of creation or something like that. They would have been there for forever. And so the idea that Krishna, God, came down into this world and then spoke the Gita at a time where he had already spoken, ordained, a body of literature that had existed for thousands of years, it does create some problems. Why didn't Krishna get it right in the beginning? Why did he have to come back and teach again? These are natural questions. And for the most part, I think that people just aren't thoughtful enough to bother having such doubts. For example, the New Testament has a story, and the story is Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Now that's like a miraculous story. That doesn't disturb the mind as much, because miracles can happen. So, we collected enough sins. God then had to come down and pay for those sins himself on our behalf. That creates a problem. The problem is that why couldn't he just forgive them? Why was the law so essential to be paid that anybody had to come down and suffer? If God wanted to forgive our sins, why couldn't he just do that? The idea that the sins had to be paid would indicate that the law was greater than God, and that God put down a law that he was then bound to. And now the law becomes God, and God becomes subservient to the law, and that becomes problematic. Did you guys follow that? But nobody thinks that, because they just don't think about it enough. And that problem Socrates came up with. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma. And he come up with it centuries before Jesus was around. That does God love that which is good, or does it become good because God loves it? If God loves that which is good, then goodness exists before and above God, and those things already are good, and God just shows up on the scene after the fact and likes them. Or if they become good because God loves them, then nothing is intrinsically good or bad, and rape and murder, for example, could just have arbitrarily been chosen by God to have been good as been chosen to be bad. So either A, there is no actual structure to the universe, and God whimsically chooses this is good or this is bad, and that's all it is, which goes against everything we experience in the world, which is some things are innately good and bad, or alternatively, things are innately good or bad, in which God is just sort of a secondary personality that doesn't really structure the universe. So that was already come up with. Socrates was asking those questions centuries before Jesus. And so the idea that, God had to give his only begotten son, which was really God's way of coming down himself, to redeem mankind because the sins were too great, and the regular yagna they did where they killed a lamb every year to extirpate the sins of the Jewish people, or they issued a scapegoat, which is where they killed a goat and then set one free into the wilderness. That's where the term scapegoat comes from. That was no longer enough, and now they had to do a human sacrifice that involved torture. And that was the only way, though, wash away the sins of man. Christ's blood washed away the sins of man. This is the core of Christianity. And it's based on it creates a huge philosophical problem. Anyway, for the most part, we think of like the miracle of Christianity as just being a storyline. And you can have stories, like there was a burning bush, and then, or the Ten Commandments, and we messed up, so then God had to punish us for not accepting the Ten Commandments. That's the idea of miracles makes sense, but when those miracles involve restructuring a body of religious teachings, that's a problem. Because why didn't God get it right the first time? Like when Jesus says, my Father had 10 commandments, I only have 2. If you see Jesus as God, that's a problem, because why did you have 10 and now you only have 2? If he sees the Son, okay, the Son's more merciful than the Father, and you kind of get away from it. But just think about it for a moment. Why didn't God get it right? Why did he teach one body of teachings early on and then had to go back and redo them later on? Does that make sense? That's a problem. Now, if you've just got one revelation, which Christians don't have just one revelation, they've got 20 different revelations in the Hebrew Bible, what goes by the name of the Old Testament, and then they have multiple other revelations in the New Testament. And they're not at all consistent. People are arguing with each other in the New Testament, and those people are arguing with people in the Old Testament. And so the idea that the Old Testament or the New Testament or those two books together provide any kind of a systematic picture of philosophy is just grossly inaccurate. There are many different teachings and ideas that are mutually contradictory presented. Paul is especially an outlier who argues with most of the apostles. Paul was not an apostle, never met Jesus, but his version of Christianity became hugely popular. This is an issue. I come later. I already gave my teachings, and I come later. Are my first teachings bad? And that's one thing. If an author writes 2 books and contradicts his first book with his second book, then usually he says that was me in my immature days, and I've come back and I've had further realizations. But that's a problem when you're dealing with a perfect person. And so this idea of an all-good, all-powerful deity who then comes back and rewrites things, it's an issue. Do you guys see that? Okay. So for the most part, we don't think like this. We just say the Vedic literatures as if they all just presto appeared at one time. But that is definitely not the case. So you've got 2 basic groups of Vedic literatures. You have the Shruti and the Smriti. The Shruti are the original Vedic text. When you're having a serious debate with somebody, theologically, a Hindu debate, usually you'll only be able to quote from the Shruti. That's the most legitimate form of, that's like the strict, it's like constitutional law. There are law professors that specialize in constitutional law. There are many, and the Supreme Court does this. There are many precedents which are set by this or that judge voting, but sometimes issues will come up and there'll be challenges to precedents that have been set by a lower court and the Supreme Court, who are all specialists in constitutional law. They will then weigh in and they will make a determination based on what the U.S. Constitution says, which is our Bible. It's a book that people got together and said, okay, this is how we're going to rule our country based on this book. We agree, and everybody who lives here or who's born here has to follow that. We don't care whether you agree or not. Just being born here because of social contract, you're automatically obliged to follow the Constitution. And no other law, federal or state or city, can go against the Constitution. Are you guys aware of this? I don't believe. You guys all nod in your head. I don't believe that all of you know that. I'm just going to ask the question again. I think you're lying to me. Who knows the point I just made? All right. How do you know that point? All right. Okay, good. All right, I accept. And so this is what you never thought of was the idea that the group of people just got together, wrote a document, and then decided everybody forever has to follow this document in our country, whether they want to or not. And you're just obliged to, and we're going to reference it as an axiomatic source of information. Everybody just has to follow it. You never had that realization. And in that sense, it's no different than a religious text. It's a text that's written, that makes an appeal to authority. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equally and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Is it self-evident that all people are created equally? If it was self-evident that all people are created equally, what would have never existed in the history of the world? Slavery. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that wouldn't exist. Racism wouldn't exist. All sorts of stuff wouldn't exist. So is it self-evident that all people are created equal? It wasn't even self-evident to the people who wrote that document, who themselves were slave owners. It's not that those people weren't slave owners. George Washington owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. They were slave owners. I'm not sure that Washington was involved in the writing of the Declaration of the Constitution. For sure, I think Thomas Jefferson was. But they weren't. It wasn't clear to them. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It's really just a fancy way of saying we've decided that these are our principles. But you see how it sounds. Self-evidence is a principle of foundationalism. It's when you're trying to build a philosophy that no one can argue with, and you look for things which are empirically verifiable or incorrigible or self-evident. Those are the three criteria that people use, and then you set up a philosophy building on that very, very carefully. Because everybody has to have a foundation for what they believe. And so they wrote this. They wrote the Constitution. And then, sometimes there's disagreements, and you got to battle it out, and you got to figure it out. And even different constitutional specialists will disagree on the meaning of the Constitution. A lot of times the Supreme Court will vote. It'll be 5-4. And then there'll be a 50-page, 100-page dissent, also from constitutional specialists on why they didn't agree with what was found. This stuff happens. You got to reconcile the later tradition with the earlier tradition, and that creates a further problem of why have a later tradition when your earlier tradition was God. Okay, fine. They were slave owners. They were like a bunch of idiots, so we have to redo what they did. That's easy enough. Your parents are faulty, so you got to go to a therapist and redo your childhood and end the cycle of abuse with you so that don't pass on to your children. Sure, no problem. But what happens when the person who came before you is God and who by definition is perfect? You follow? And then what do you do? And because these kind of questions are disturbing, for the most part, we just think of a religious teaching as being somewhat like flat in the sense that it wasn't there, and then all of a sudden it's there, and it's there in its entirety. And the idea of the evolution of a religion over centuries, or in Hinduism's case, over millennia, we don't like to think that way. We just think this is the Vedic tradition. These are the Vedic literatures. Our teachings are this. The teachings of our gurus and the sadhus and the shastra, our predecessors, and our religious texts are this. But the shastra, your scriptural statements, are just the words of teachers from a long time ago. And you have your words of your teachers from nowadays. And they have to be and they're in perfect alignment. They are not. There are differences of opinion. And so reconciling that is important. And in many ways, that's what's happening in this chapter. In many ways, that's what's happening in this chapter. This chapter, more than any other chapter of the Gita, is Krishna taking his teachings and putting them into Upanishadic language. Now that's very difficult for all of you. It's not difficult for me, but it's difficult for all of you guys. Why is it difficult for all of you guys? Let me say it again. Krishna here is taking his teachings and then reconciling them with the pre-existing tradition, the Upanishads here. And that's a real problem for you guys. Not for me, but for you. Why is it a problem for you?
We haven't read the Upanishads.
You haven't read the Upanishads. That's a big problem, because if this chapter is about reconciling the Gita with the earlier Upanishadic literature, then you have a huge problem, because you don't know the earlier Upanishadic literature, and you won't be able to understand what Krishna is doing and how he's reconciling, or if he's diverging, or what. He's referencing a bunch of things. He's quoting direct verses from the Upanishads in this chapter. And every single theme in this chapter is something which is covered in the Upanishads. But if you don't know that, then it's just like if Jesus quotes the Hebrew Torah and you don't know the Hebrew Torah. You don't understand the relevance of his quotation of that. You have a further problem. It's less onerous, but it's still a problem for you guys. The further problem you have, which is even more humbling for you guys to acknowledge, is what?
Vocabulary.
That would be vocabulary. It's not so humbling. It's a vocabulary. You're not familiar with it. If you're not familiar with the teachings, you wouldn't necessarily be familiar with the vocabulary as well. It's a good point. There's a more humbling thing you have to admit to. For sure, Madan's got it. I can see by the sheepish smile on his face that he understands. I'm not sure about anybody else, but I'm sure you have the answer correct. What's the answer? I mean, there's that too, but that wasn't what I was thinking of. But thank you for that little flattery. Appreciate that. Thanks for the love. Do you know the answer?
We don't understand Krishna's teachings.
You don't understand the Gita. You don't understand the Gita, and you don't understand the pre-existing tradition. We've got a problem on our hands. I have a solution. Okay? Here's a solution. For the next 20, 30 minutes, give us your undivided attention. And we will do our level best to wade through a few verses, explain the Upanishadic teaching, and where Krishna's teachings diverge from the Upanishads. Got it? All right. Let's start on text 8. Let's go back and start on text 8. And look at your books. Don't look at me. If you don't have a book, find a book. Because we're going to get into this. Here we go. Abhyasa Yoga Yuktena. By yoking yourself to Abhyas Yoga. By yoking yourself to Abhyas Yoga. Yukta is the past participle of yuj, same root as the word yoga. By yoking yourself to Abhyas Yoga. To the practice of yoga. Abhyas means practice. Chetasananya Gamina, and with your mind going nowhere else. Paramam Purusham Divyam Anuchintayan Yati. By thinking of the Paramam Purusham Divyam, of the Supreme Divine Person, Yati, you will go to him. He who meditates on me, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. You see what Prabhupada did there, by the way? He who meditates on me, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. What did Prabhupada do there? He changed something. What did he change? Say it again. Krishna says, think about the Supreme Divine Person. The Supreme Divine Person is not Krishna, because Krishna, the Supreme Divine Person, is spoken of in the third person. And Prabhupada translates as think of me. How do we defend Prabhupada's translation? Yeah?
Because earlier several times Krishna has established the context of the Purushottam, the Supreme Godhead, and has correlated it to being him.
I mean, that was so confusing that no one understood you except for me. Anybody understand her? Okay, tell me what she said.
She said that Krishna had already established that he is the supreme in previous chapters.
No, that's not what he said. He didn't understand you. Anybody understand her? Go ahead.
I think she was trying to say that in the immediately preceding verses, Krishna had already established that he was the supreme personality.
That's what he just said. So how did you add anything to what he just said?
He said the text and like all of the chapters.
That's not what he says. What does Krishna say in the earlier chapters? In the earlier verses? He says, think of me. He does not say, I am the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That is taught in places in the Gita, not in the verses immediately preceding this. Therefore, you misled everybody. Be more careful. It's okay, don't be sorry, but be more careful. Plus, it was just very onerous what you said. What you need to say is, Krishna just finished saying, think of me. Then he says, and if you think of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, if we connect the earlier verses where Krishna says, think of me, with the later verse where he said, think of the personality of Godhead, then we solve the problem. But why would he switch to talking in the third person? Why would he not just say, think of me? How does that... Because Krishna could be saying, think of me. Like, for instance, I could say... Listen to what I say, and then listen to what your mother says. I'm not saying I'm your mother. I'm saying listen to me, listen to what your mother says. That's two instructions. One is listen to me, the other one is listen to your mother. How do we then combine that and say, Tukaram is your mother? How do you get that? That doesn't make any sense. Are you guys following this or not? Nitai, you following this? Answer the question. Excellent. The Upanishads speak in the third person about divinity. Krishna in the Gita speaks in the first person. The Upanishads say, think of Brahman. Krishna says, think of me. He is drawing a connection between the earlier Upanishad teachings and the teachings that he's espousing now, which are the same teachings, but they become more personalized. And what was previously Tat Brahman, that Brahman is now becoming Mom, me. You see this? What's happening? Now, can I say, listen to me? Can I talk to my children, go, listen to me? You got to listen to your father? Is that appropriate? Does that ever happen? Of course it happens. When do I use the third person to refer to myself? It's not just when people are idiots and poorly educated and have a hugely inflated sense of ego that they refer to themselves in the third person. Like Dalen is like, the Dalen likes to do this on the weekends, and the Dalen's doing this and doing that, and you're like, really, dude? What's your problem? You know? Right? Or, a KD says like, the level 4 burpees guy is doing this and doing that. And you're like, really, man? You're going to refer to yourself by your handle? And so that's usually we think of somebody referring to themselves in the third person as being when they're just a colossal, puffed up jerk. However, there is a context in which it's appropriate to refer to yourself in the third person. When is that context? Ross?
For effect, like to pronounce what you're trying to say more?
I don't know that it pronounces that you're a jerk. I don't know if it pronounces, it has the effect of making people think you're a jerk. In what circumstances do we refer to ourselves in the third person?
When we're representing a distinction or a post.
That's right. When you are referring to your position. Right? Listen to what I'm telling you. I'm your father, and you got to listen to your father. You follow? When the judge pronounces you guilty, you're guilty. And the judge is pronouncing you guilty. Could a judge say that? For sure. They're speaking as a judge. Ma'am, the police are on the scene now. So you just got to let us do our job. You see what's happening? You salute the rank, not the person. Your captain's speaking, you got to do what he says. When you are referring to yourself in an official capacity, you sometimes refer to your post or your job or your official position to communicate and accentuate. Right? So you got two things here. Krishna is establishing himself as a supreme divine person, A. B, Krishna's connecting himself to the earlier Upanishadic teachings about the supreme divine person that you're supposed to meditate on. You see how slick that is? Think of me. Remember me. Do your duty. While thinking of me, you'll achieve perfection. You will go to the supreme divine being by practicing this yoga of thinking about the supreme and nothing else. It flows. And then Krishna explains how to do that. Text 10. Kavim Puranam Anushashitaram. Kavim. You should meditate on God as being Kavi. Kavi means the most learned. Puranam. Purana means the oldest, the most ancient. Anushashitaram. He's controlling everyone else. Ano Anyangsang. He's smaller than the smallest. Anusmarad Yaha. One should remember the Lord as being these things. Sarvasya Dattaram, who's the maintainer of everything. Achintya Rupam, who has an inconceivable form. That statement, Achintya Rupam, gives joy to the Vaishnavas to hear. Why does that statement give joy to the Vaishnavas to hear? If you don't feel joy, you're not a Vaishnava. If you do feel joy, you may be a Vaishnava. Tell me why. You know, because I told you last week when you failed miserably, as did you. But Nitai wasn't here last week. Let's hear it, Nitai. Why does that give you joy? That's right. Beautiful, right? It's a chintya. It's inconceivable, right? It's beyond this world, right? Tamasa parastat is the next verse, right? Aditya varnam tamasa parastat. Beyond, radiant like the sun and beyond all darkness. But the Lord has a form. It may be a transcendental form. It may be a form beyond this world. But form is not a deficiency. Material form is a deficiency. Spiritual form wouldn't make you deficient. Having a material mind would be a deficiency. Having a spiritual mind would be an asset. Without a spiritual mind, could you love someone? Could you love God forever without some kind of a spiritual mind? Could you embrace God without some kind of a spiritual form? Could you embrace God if God didn't have a spiritual form? Maybe if God was like a gas, could you dive into the gas? Dive into the oneness? Some kind of intimate connection to the deity requires you to have some form, the Lord to have some form, for you to have thoughts, for the Lord to have thoughts. And in this verse, in this simple statement, which are statements, by the way, this verse is two verses from the Upanishads mashed up together. These are verses from the Upanishads, directly quoted by Krishna. The pre-existing tradition. Now, one thing you want to do is you want to reconcile the older tradition with the newer revelation. And we have a whole bunch of strategies how we do this. We say originally there was one Veda. And it was taught, just the guru would speak it and the disciple would remember it. But then what eventually happened? You should be able to answer this question, Cam. What eventually happened? Why was it divided? This is an important detail. It's a little detail of our theology. It's super important for this point. Who knows that? Who knows the answer? Why was the one Veda divided into four and written down? Yes. Huh? That's right. Our memory decreased. and therefore we could not understand the one Veda. So the Veda was divided into four and written down, so it could be taught. Right? Then we didn't understand the Veda. So what book had to be written because we didn't understand the Veda?
The Gita.
The Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which are called itihasa, the histories. And why were they written down? There's a class of people they were written down for. Women and Shudras, that's right. Good old patriarchal Vedas. Of course, if you're like feeling like, oh man, why are they hating on women? We're all Shudras. So Kalo Sudra Sambhavan. Everybody's a Shudra in Kali Yuga. So they're written down for less intelligent people. Why are the Mahabharata and Ramayana for less intelligent people? They tell stories. And they mix the philosophy in with the stories. You see what's happening here? An explanation is being given why our scriptural tradition was added to over time. And how it doesn't represent a deficiency on the part of God. It rather represents a deficiency on our part. This happens with the problem of evil. Problem of evil is a big problem. Why is the problem of evil a big problem? Simple question. Should have a simple answer. You should all be able to answer this question. If you can't answer this question, I'm like doubtful whether you're even a theist. Forget being a Vaishnava. I'm just doubting whether you're even a theist. What's the problem of evil?
If there's evil in the world, then that means...
If there's evil in the world. Is there evil in the world? Yes. And if the person says no, then you just show them pictures of children being tortured until they agree yes. Or until everybody else in the room agrees yes, and they look like an idiot. So there is evil in the world. I have to say if there's evil in the world. There is evil in the world, and...
God's responsible.
That's a little unsophisticated. Let's make that a little better. Who can add to that and make it a little more sophisticated, a little more succinct, or at least a little more clean? Who knows they can do it? Raise your hand big. Don't do this. Show me. Prove to me you can do it so I know who to... I want to see someone with confidence. All right. Ishwar.
If God is all good and powerful, why would He create a world in which there would be people who would be allowed to exist?
Perfect. And if we want to make it even better than what he said, by cleaning it up just a little bit, but not changing anything, how would we clean it up? If God was all good, then he wouldn't want for evil to exist. And if God was all powerful, then he could create a world in which evil did not exist. Therefore, the existence of evil that we just pointed out demonstrates that God is either A, not all good, or B, not all powerful, or C, doesn't exist at all. You see that? It's not just all good and all powerful, it's in an order. Do you follow that, Ishwar? Yes. And it's important to give that order because it fleshes out the problem. Do you follow this? Okay. And the solution to the problem of evil is to do what? Yeah.
Introduce free will.
Introduce free will so that we are responsible for evil and not God. Similarly, the way to resolve the problem of why is Krishna writing new books is he's writing new books to flow with us who are progressively more and more stupid. You get it? See the strategy? Far out, right? You find stuff like this. My belly is filled with the burnt offerings, and I will accept them no more because I desire mercy and not sacrifice. That's from Hosea 6 in the Hebrew Bible. It's a critique by God of the animal sacrifice that he had previously commissioned. And a statement that he wanted something higher. Guess who quotes that verse from the Hebrew Bible? Jesus himself in the New Testament. He selects something that's there in the Hebrew Bible to then demonstrate the legitimacy of what he's teaching, and that what he's teaching is not a schism or a breach from the older tradition, but it's rather a revival or a return to the original teachings. We are unwilling to concede that the Gita represents a new revelation. Guess who else is unwilling to concede that the Gita represents a new revelation? Krishna, which is why he's taking the trouble to link up his current teachings at this time with the pre-existing teachings so we will see continuity. Do you guys follow this? It's far out, isn't it? What's happening? All right, let's get a couple more verses in. Those were the verses we did previously. Prayana kale manasa achalena bhaktya yukto yoga balena chaiva. Prayana kale, at the time of death, manasa achalena, with an undeviating mind. You know how you say in Hindi, you'll say chalo? Let's go. Right? Right? It's the same root. Chal. Chal means to move. Achalena, without moving. Manasa, with a mind that doesn't move. Bhaktya yukto yoga balena chaiva, by the strength of yoga, by being yoked to bhakti. Bruvo madhye pranam avesha samyak, with your prana being situated between your eyebrows. Satam param purusham upaiti divyam, you will attain the Supreme Person. If at the time of death your mind does not move by the strength of yoga, by being yoked to bhakti and situating your prana between your eyebrows, you will achieve the divine person. Did you follow this? This verse gives the Vaishnavas joy too. Why does this verse give the Vaishnavas joy? Because it says bhakti. You fools didn't remember that. I had to I said it 10 times last week and you guys didn't remember it. It was so disturbing to me. When we see the word bhakti, because what word is not very prevalent in the Upanishads? That's right. And so this verse is explicated repeatedly. It's used repeatedly in a text like the Gita. And it gives joy to us because it shows that even though, you see what Krishna's doing? Right? Situating your prana between your eyebrows, that's an Upanishadic concept. With your mind being undeviated, also Upanishadic. Yoga Balena, the strength of yoga, also. The Supreme Divine Person, also. At the time of death, also. All of these are older Upanishadic concepts. Prana is also from the Upanishads. The idea of prana, of your life force being focused. All that's in the Upanishads. And then Krishna just slides in with bhakti as part of this discussion of old Vedic ideas. Now, there's two ways you can go. See how clever Krishna is? He folds in his new teaching in with the older teachings. Would we agree to that? We would not agree to that. We would not agree to that. He's folding in his new teaching with the older teaching. No way would we agree to that. Why wouldn't we agree to that, Nitai? Why am I refusing to agree with that statement I just made? Answer.
Because there are no new teachings, because the old teachings were perfect.
Because there are no new teachings, because the old teachings are perfect. Were you guys not listening to what I did? They take the whole first half of class of teaching? Huh?
That's exactly the point. You just established that the teachings are the same.
Therefore, look how clever Krishna is. He references all the old stuff. Manasa achalena, with your mind undeviating. Prayana kale, at the time of death, both from the Upanishads. Prana avesha, bruvo madhye, with your prana being situated between your eyebrows, also an Upanishadic concept. Upaiti param divyam purusham, you'll attain the Supreme Divine Person, also an older Upanishadic concept. Yoga balena, with the power of yoga, also an older Upanishadic concept. Bhaktya yukto, yoked to bhakti, new concept. See how clever Krishna is? He folds in his new teaching with the older teachings. But I won't accept that. Why won't I accept that? Because they're not different teachings. Krishna is making something clear. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Puranas and the Tantras and the Agamas and our teachers and their poetry and their songs are taking the older teachings, which were more cryptic and difficult to understand, and they're unpacking them and showing you their actual meaning in a language you can understand because you're too stupid to understand them the way they were originally taught. Now, if I want to make such a claim, which sounds sexy when you make it, but I'm on out a limb. Somebody could just cut me down. What can they say?
Why wasn't it easy in the first place?
Because it was written so that people gradually evolve. That's a great answer. It's not the answer I wanted, but it's an excellent answer. It's an excellent challenge. And the answer to that excellent challenge, which is a natural challenge, is, and I feel stupid for having not anticipated that and refine my question a little bit. The answer to that would be that the teachings were originally written for people who were able to evolve and gradually understand them over time. And for that to really take hold in the heart, there has to be enough crypticness and enough remoteness that you have to want it, because desire is a prerequisite to knowledge. And so Krishna doesn't just hit you over the head with it, but he gives it to you in a digestible format, and it was always done that way, but it anticipated a higher level of acumen on your part. And when Krishna realized you didn't have that, and you were really truly a grade schooler, and you were like actually functionally retarded, that you didn't have the ability to evolve, you were forever going to be a 3-year-old, he then dumbed down his teaching so even a 3-year-old could understand it. That would be the answer to that. But there's another problem, and the problem is that somebody could then challenge me, prove it. Show us in the older tradition, bhakti. And we can do that. Thinking of the Supreme Divine Person as the most beautiful, as having an amazing form, as being beyond darkness. These are the glories of God. And when you think about these glories of God and you meditate on them, you fall in love with God. And you realize God is the only thing worth achieving. And that you become focused on the deity and nothing else. And a focus on the deity and nothing else, to understand the value of thinking about the deity compared to thinking about everything else. Let's think of a word that will describe that state of affairs. What's that word? Boom. You see it? Do you guys follow this? You may not follow this. If you really don't understand the Gita, this will be tough to follow. I can't take us all the way back to the beginning. I'm taking us back somewhat. I can't take it all the way back to the beginning. But the idea of bhakti is falling in love with God, focusing on God, that being the most important thing in your life. Having a relationship with a deity who has a beautiful form, who is filled with wonderful qualities that make your heart flutter. And that's exactly the state of affairs that's described in the Upanishads, as directly quoted in the preceding verse. And then Krishna just gives a name to it, a name to that state of affairs, an easy name. This happens sometimes, like tweets. Tweets. Right? Or there was a phenomenon called ICQ. It was like an early form of instant messaging. ICQ. Remember that? And so people say, yeah, I'll ICQ you. I'll DM you. Right? Slipping into your DMs, you know? Right? Why that term come up? Because people started having a common experience, and so they came up with a language which described that for us. It's not that instant messaging didn't exist before the term DM came up, but eventually came up to refer to it in an easy way so we could all make a shorthand. And so this evolved state of consciousness where you're thinking about God and falling in love with God, making him the focal point of your life and achieving him as the goal of your life, as the most important thing in your life, we eventually came up with a language which described that in a simple, easy term that we all agreed upon. And that term is bhakti. And so this is Krishna modernizing and making it easier for us to understand what's going on. Can you guys see it? That's the challenge. People can say, prove it. It's in the Upanishads. Prove it. Like sometimes you'll argue with like Ramanujis, and they'll be like, oh, show me Radha. And we're just like, yeah, show me Sita. Show me Radha in the Vedas. Okay, Radha's not in the Vedas. But the Sri Sukta is there. But the Sri Sukta is different than Sita of the Ramayana. And all the Ramanujis worship Sita Devi. Even Ramanuja's own name is a name of the brother of Ram, Ramanuja. The younger brother of Ram is a name for Lakshman. And so in the South Indian lineage, sometimes they critique the worship of Radha and Krishna, but they accept the worship of Sita and Ram. Sita and Ram's nowhere found in the Upanishads. Radharani's nowhere found in the Upanishads. But the idea of Sri Sukta, is found in the earliest Strata-Vedic literature, a feminine deity. Even in the Purusha Sukta, the deity is referred to in feminine terms. And so you find like ideas, like these type of ideas are there. A feminine name for divinity, a feminine conception of divinity. And then that eventually gets explored and discussed in the tradition, and there's room for a further extrapolation, or a further revelation, a further unpacking of what was there in an incipient, seed-like genetic code, hidden, but there. And then we clarify it, put a name on it. Do you guys follow this? We can find Bhakti in the Upanishads. We can find Radharani in the Upanishads. We can find, and it's important for us to show these connections to the pre-existing tradition, because we accept that the pre-existing tradition was perfect and complete, and therefore, even if we extrapolate on it or we fill in the gap, we need to show that the structure was sound from the beginning. And our tradition, for thousands of years, has done a phenomenal job of demonstrating adherence. And I mean, prior to the age of being able to do internet searches or even having encyclopedias, they were memorizing hundreds of books and mining through them, looking for the thread of continuity that tied it all together. Nana Shastra Vichara Naika Nipuno Sat Dharma Samstapakal. We glorify our Goswamis 500 years ago because they considered many different shastras and established the Sat Dharma, the essential features of our tradition. They were vastly learned. They knew thousands of verses by heart. They'd read and memorized hundreds of texts. And so our little following in their wake is to notice these connections and to be able to demonstrate them if called upon to do so. That was the challenge I was thinking of. So I didn't just want to say they added Bhakti. I wanted to show you guys how Bhakti was what was said. It just wasn't quite as clear. Think about it. You should think of God as having an unbelievably beautiful form, inconceivably beautiful form, beyond all darkness, radiant like the sun. He's smaller than the smallest. He's everywhere at all times. He's the most learned, the most ancient. It's like, and at the same time, he's maintaining everything. And the smaller than the smallest is like a humble deity. He's also like infiltrating everywhere, including your own heart is the implication of that, by the way. And you should think of him constantly and go to him. These are beautiful ideas that form the core of bhakti. They form the core of bhakti. And so the fact that Krishna comes up with a simple term is nice. It's beautiful. I want to keep moving. We got to keep moving here. One who at the time of death fixes his life air between the eyebrows, and by the strength of yoga, with an undeviating mind, engages himself in remembering the Supreme Lord in full devotion, will certainly attain the Supreme Personality of Godhead. What a beautiful translation. Yak aksharam veda vidho vadanti vishanti yat yatayo vitaraga. That which is described as akshar by those who know the Vedas. What is akshar? Om, that's right. What is described as akshar by those who know the Vedas. Vishanti yatayo vitaraga, and that which is entered into by those sannyasis who are free from passion. Yati means sannyasis, who are free from passion. Yat ichanto brahmacharyam shanti, that which the brahmacharis desire, that which those practicing brahmacharya desire. Tatte padam sangrahena pravakshe, that place I will describe summarily to you. Persons who are learning the Vedas, who utter Omkar, who are great sages in the renounced order, enter into Brahman. Desiring such perfection, one practices celibacy. I shall now briefly explain to you the process by which one may attain that state. Okay, what else can we note immediately in these verses? Nitai. What can we immediately note in this verse? What we can immediately note is those who know the Vedas, referring to the Upanishadic tradition, what they refer to as akshar, a term used in the Upanishads. Brahmacharya, practicing celibacy, which is delineated in the Upanishadic literature. Yatis, sannyasis, also spoken of in the Vedic literature, who desire the supreme Parampadam, the supreme mode, also a term used for heaven, used in the Upanishads. He's using all Upanishadic language. I want to get to someplace. I think I want to get to text 14. So we got to move quick. Sarva dvarani samyamya, controlling all the doors. What does that mean? You mean the chakras? No. Good guess though. Let's go. Boom, the doors. 2 eyes. How many doors are there? 9. Let's get them. 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 doors to the body. The ways in which things go in and the way in which things come out. You follow? 9 gates, 9 doors. Sarvadvarani samyamya, controlling all the doors. Manohridi nirudhyacha, controlling or curbing the mind and the heart. Controlling the mind in the heart. Murdni adhyatmana pranam, and fixing the prana of the self in the head. Also a concept from the Upanishads. Rising up your energy. Not lowering your energy. Right? That's why the headstand's so popular. Because it makes gravity pull your energy upwards towards your head. The whole practice of Kundalini Yoga, I mean the whole thing. If you do bandhas, if you do mudras, if you do pranayam, all these hatha yoga, tantric practices that people do, they're about sealing up your genitals and your anus and then bellowing the air in your body to make your prana rise up. Kundalini, all about rising up your prana. The Ida and the Pingala, rising up through your Sushumna Nadi towards your head. The Nadi is an Upanishadic idea that was evolved through these tantric practices, but it has its origin in the Upanishad, the idea of nadis within the body. It all comes from the Upanishads. And it's being spoken of here. Astito Yoga Dharanam. And that's being situated in this position of holding yoga, of being firm in one's practice of yoga. The yogic situation is that of detachment from all sensual engagements, closing all the doors of the senses and fixing the mind on the heart and the life air at the top of the head. One establishes himself in yoga. Again, full Upanishads, right? Here's another one. Om iti eka aksharam brahma vyaharanmam anusmaram. You're remembering me while chanting Om. You're vibrating Om and you're remembering me. And that Om is Aksharam Brahma, is the supreme Brahman, is the undecaying Brahman. That term undecaying Brahman, Akshar, that term Brahman, those are terms which are especially used in the Upanishads, not just to refer to Om, but to refer to the deity that you should meet. Tat Brahma, that Brahman, which now becomes Anusmaram Mam, remembering me. You see that? What's going on here? He's joining those two ideas together. Yat prayati tyajan deham. At the time you leave your body, give up your body. Sayati paramam gatim, and you go to the supreme abode. Paramam gatim, that's Upanishadic language as well. Again, this idea of leaving your body in a perfect state of consciousness, which was the focus of the Upanishadic literature. After being situated in yoga practice, vibrating the sacred syllable Om, the supreme combination of letters of one thinks of the Supreme Personality of God and quits his body, he will certainly reach the spiritual planets. And here's the verse I wanted to read. Ananya cheta satatam yos mam smarati nityasa. Ananya cheta satatam, with your mind always undeviatingly. Mam smarati nityasa, always remembering me. One who, without their mind ever deviating, always remembers me. Tasyaham, for that person I am sulabha partha, I am easy to attain. Nitya yuktasya yogina, for the one who is always yoked to me, for that yogi who is always yoked to me. For that yogi who is always yoked to me, by always remembering me and not thinking of anything else, for that person I am easy to achieve. This verse is beautiful because it simplifies the pre-existing process. Like Jesus said, my Father had 10 commandments, I only have 2. Love God with your whole heart, love your neighbors yourself. What you're finding here is Krishna simplifying the teachings of the Upanishads. He's gone over, first of all, what he just described is not easy at all. And so in many ways, this verse is an end cap to those verses, which simplifies and summarizes it very simply as, always remember me. If you're doing the other practice, it had to be bhaktya yukta. It had to be with bhakti. It had to involve anusmara, mam, remembering me. Those things were there, along with all these other difficult practices. And now those practices have become less significant, and the most important feature that sometimes got lost in translation as people got too attached to ritual details and doing things as complicated as possible. Just like you spoke in such a complicated way to say, Krishna said earlier, to remember me. He could have just said that. But you had to show you how smart you were by saying something so complicated. Showing that your brain is not working properly. You follow? It's like when someone writes code and they write like a very complicated piece of code, but then a real code master comes in and they just write one line of code. And they're like, wouldn't that accomplish it? And then the person who wrote pages of code goes, I think it all bent out of shape. Because they want to make everything complicated instead of simple. You follow? And so Krishna is simplifying things here. Because these other things were important, they were relevant, they helped. But sometimes you miss the forest for the trees. Sometimes you take a ritual and you become ritualistic. You take a doctrine, you become doctrinaire. You take something beautiful that has a purpose behind it, you forget the purpose, and all you're left with is the details. Like there was a guru teaching, and a cat was meowing. So one of his disciples went and got the cat, got a basket, put the cat in the basket, took the cat away. So the guru could give a lecture. 1,000 years passed, 40 generations passed. His great descendant guru was there. He was getting ready to give class, and they brought out a cat, walked it around the tree 3 times. Put the cat in a ceremonial basket that the chief disciple carried on his head and exited. The lecture began. Somebody asked, why are you doing this? He goes, I don't know, my guru did it. And what originally had a purpose, the purpose was lost, and you were left with an empty ritual. And Krishna is revitalizing the tradition by showing you this. He's showing you this. It's elegant, it's beautiful, it's amazing. He's showing you this. The Gita is, in some ways, a kind of a clarifying, a simplifying of these teachings so that it becomes more difficult for you to get lost. Because there's dharmasya glani. Krishna says in the Gita that religion degrades over time. People become contaminated over time. And therefore the teachings have to be, old wine has to be put in a new bottle so you can get it, so you can appreciate it, so it can become living for you. It has to be passed down. And that's what Krishna is doing in a very important way. And what we're left with is that he's very easy to achieve. Just remember Krishna. Just think of him. It's simple, actually. Make him important. Make Krishna important in your life. Decide that thinking about Krishna is worthwhile. And if you want to think about Krishna, then you have to start to practice living a spiritual lifestyle. And therefore you have to stop eating meat or taking drugs or fooling around. That's like the basics. Then you got to stop reading the newspapers like your life depends on it, getting all wrapped up in petty stuff, getting all wrapped up in petty people. You got to start to associate with high-minded people. You got to bring your A game. It's simple. It's easy to cut into. But it does the same job. Instead of getting attached to a bunch of rituals and then eventually realizing that God's the most important thing to think about, you can decide that God's the most important thing to think about on the front end and then gradually bring your life in accord with that dangerous, huge, colossal, perennial, eternal idea, which was at the heart of the Upanishadic revelation. And so Krishna is not merely recapping what the Upanishads teaching. He's also not introducing a new teaching. He is making it really easy by getting to the core of the issue, by getting to the heart of the issue. And that's amazing. And the Gita is beautiful. And it's strongly connected with the pre-existing tradition. And this chapter, Krishna really wants us to understand that. And so for us, we're disadvantaged because we don't know Sanskrit, we don't know the Upanishads, we don't know the Gita, and so we have to learn the language, which we try to do today, enough that you could get the point. We have to learn the Upanishads, which we try to do today, enough so you could get the point. And we have to learn what the Gita is teaching and how it relates to that pre-existing tradition. And you guys gave me your kind attention for about 35, 40 minutes, and we were able to do all that. Because it can be done. You can get it. You can learn this stuff. It's not impossible. It takes focus. It takes some energy, but it's not impossible. You can answer questions like, why does Krishna keep teaching different things? How come the Vedic literatures teach all different kinds of things? Why weren't the Upanishads enough? How is the Gita related to the Upanishads? You can answer these questions. And these questions are important. And even when you're looking at the Jewish tradition, even when you're looking at the Christian tradition, and how the Christian tradition relates to itself and to the pre-existing Jewish tradition, and how the Jewish religion relates to itself and the pre-existing Babylonian tradition, you have this kind of stuff going on. We just don't notice it because we're not learned enough. But it's always happening. They're troubleshooting. They're making important points. They're teaching you the full... I mean, those traditions may not be doing it. Who knows? Who cares? It's not my business. But we need to understand our tradition and be able to troubleshoot it and have it make sense and realize it's what everybody's doing all over the world for all time. If you understand that, you can start to appreciate where our tradition is special, where it does things differently, where it's dealing with very, very high concepts. That magic comes out. It's amazing. You can appreciate the thread of continuity with all traditions, and then you can appreciate what makes your tradition special, and you can even appreciate what makes some other traditions special too. You can even appreciate others. And you can grow. Find that thread of continuity, but not at the expense of looking at what's special about each tradition. Okay. Thank you, IGTV. Some feedback. Yes.